Okay. So, we're going to do a little bit of an abbreviated presentation today, which is going to be, we're going to be a little bit shorter on the why are we doing this information, because we've talked about that tons. What I am going to get into is what portion of the Girdwood Comprehensive Plan development that we're currently focusing on with these land use plan maps, in the hopes that it can help guide your comments and help understand where we are in the process and what has all led into the development of the maps. Okay. So, like I said, the things that we're going to talk about today are what has led into the development of the future land use plan maps, which are the vision, goals, and policy document, the population, housing, and employment analysis, and then the existing condition and land suitability analysis. And those three things are what are leading into the development of the future land use plan map. Now, Michelle and Bree are going to give a more detailed presentation tonight on the population, housing, and employment analysis. And Bree's going to talk a little bit more about the existing condition and land suitability analysis, because those are the things combined with the vision and goals and policies that led to the future land use plan map, which Bree is also going to talk about. Okay. So we're going to breeze through these items because I want to give Bree and Michelle enough time, but just for a little bit more context, right? For those of you who haven't heard this, we're in the process of updating your 1995 Girdwood Comprehensive Plan. And that's your overarching plan and policy document for the Valley. Now, beneath the Girdwood Comprehensive Plans are things which we call the functional plans or area-specific plans. The person who just joined, can you please mute yourself? So the Girdwood Trails Plan is an example of a functional plan. The Girdwood South Town Site Area Master Plan is an example of an area-specific plan. And these are all comprehensive plan elements, right? They're an element of your overall Girdwood Comprehensive Plan. From there are more implementation type actions, and those are things like Title 21, Chapter 9, which is the Girdwood chapter, which implements your land use plan, and then other things like capital improvement plans. Okay, so like I said, these are the things that are included in your comprehensive plan: vision and goals, future land use plan map, and policies and implementation actions. And these are things that are defined in Title 21 that are required to be part of your comprehensive plan. Okay, so what is the focus of tonight? The focus of tonight is this future land use plan map and the things that went into developing that. This was your future land use plan map for 1995. And the process is to update this to reflect the community's current vision and goals, and new economic trends, new demographic trends, that sort of thing. Okay, so I think we still need to do the little refresher on what is land use, because I think it's important to understand the difference between land use, the difference between land use and zoning. And I'm going to have Daniel do this. So go ahead, Daniel. And you're not going to have the fancy PowerPoint situation. So
that's okay.
Okay.
I just put a link in the chat, and it's a slider map. So anybody can look and you can compare zoning to the various land use maps for Eagle River, the Bowl, and Girdwood, the 1995 plan. So land use in general is just sort of the types of activities you expect in a location. So when you're looking at these future land use maps, it's pretty general. It says this is the kind of area where we probably want residential stuff. This is the kind of area where we want commercial stuff. This is the kind of area we want industrial stuff. And then from there, you can kind of make it more and more particular You can see in Girdwood, this is where we want single family residential. This is where we want multifamily residential. This is where we want a mix of commercial and residential. So it's not saying how tall the building can be, what color the paint has to be, how many windows it has to have. It's just saying this is the general idea of the type of stuff that's going to be in this area. So that's what any land use plan map, future land use plan map is going to be. So if you look in the link that I put in there, you can slide it and you'll see some say like B3, GR1, that's the zoning. So that's the very particular rules about what can or can't be done there. And then you slide the other way and you'll see that's the land use designations. That's the general idea. So this whole process was thinking about in the future, what kind of activities do we expect in different parts of Girdwood? And so when we're looking at this map that you see on the PowerPoint slide, that's sort of what people in 1995 were thinking. This is what we expect to see the types of activities in the future. And it's a guess, right? It's sort of more like you're thinking about what do we expect? What do we think? It's never going to be exactly that way because, of course, over time things change, and you need a little bit of flexibility there. So that was the starting point, looking at 1995, and of course, then going through the process to looking what it's going to look like in the future. The biggest part of that is looking at the goals and priorities, right? Because a land use plan map is really a reflection of the values of a community. So if you have a community that says we want all of this land to be just farms, that is a statement of values, right? It's saying we value farms over every other use. Or if you have a community that says we want all of this land to be very strict single family residential, then they're saying, okay, we prioritize this type of housing over every single other thing. So that's what's really beneath every land use plan map is the values of the community. And of course, values change over time. So the 1995 plan was made according to the set of values in 1995. The maps that comes out of this process will be according to the goals, vision that has come out of the Imagine Girdwood process. So, and those were established a while ago. It's a really good set, I think. Actually, I think it provides a pretty clear idea just reading through them. You say, oh, I have a really good feeling of what the community of Girdwood values. And so just think of the map, whatever comes out of this is sort of those values put into sort of this, the landscape and colored in these different ways. Does anybody have any questions on that? So yeah, I'll just, on this slide, really, so we started with the 1995. Again, it's thinking, how did people see general activity in Girdwood on the land in 1995? And then the next phase is, well, how do you see it looking in the future? And then once you have that land use plan map established, that's when you can think about, okay, is the zoning, which is the actual rules of what you can or can't build, does that align with what the land use plan map says? And in state law and all the law, it basically says that zoning has to implement the plan, zoning has to implement the land use map. So that will be the step later. So if you have a concern, you say, well, I don't want buildings in this area to be taller than 35 feet. That's something that would be in zoning. In a land use plan map, you'd say something like, we don't want buildings to be that tall or something like that, right? This would be, we want this to be a lower height area, something sort of vague in general. I think that's sort of my spiel. I'd be glad to answer any questions if anybody has any. And again, I really encourage you to look at that slider map, and you can look at how the zoning in Girdwood pretty much lines up pretty closely with the land use plan map from 1995. If you go up to Anchorage, you can see it's a little bit different, right? There are places where in Anchorage they said, we want this area to be a city center. Right now, it's not a city center. So the zoning is maybe one way, but in the future, it's going to be another way. Or you'll see parts of a neighborhood, we say, no, we actually want this to be higher density in the future. So in the bowl, it'll be brown on the land use map. But if you slide back over to the zoning, right now it's yellow because it's low density zoning. So it's kind of a fun tool to play around with.
Okay, so I'm gonna get right to the detailed content. And I said this at the public meeting on the 11th, but again, you have your community vision and goals. Those are the overarching vision, goals, and policies that are driving this. So we're gonna start with Michelle, and she's gonna talk about the population, housing, and employment analysis. And this is what I said at the meeting. I want everybody to think about. This is what we talk about as the demand for land, right? Based on the current economic, housing, employment, population situation. This is going to be what you're currently experiencing for land demand. And then Bree is going to get into the existing conditions analysis. And that's really talking about what you have. That's the supply. That's the different types of land that you have now. Okay. And again, that will move toward the future land use plan map. Okay. So I think, Michelle, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Holly. I'm going to try to share my screen. Are you able to see the PowerPoint slides? Wonderful. Okay, great. So today I will be sharing the draft findings from the population, housing, and employment analysis that we have conducted for the Girdwood Comprehensive Plan. The purpose of this analysis is to inform the economic and demographic chapter of the Girdwood Comprehensive Plan. And the goal is to help community and planners develop land use policies and implementation strategies as part of that comprehensive plan process. This study characterizes broader trends and works towards translating those broader trends towards potential demand for land, and can help you think about the amount of land needed over time in your community. The steps we have taken to approach this analysis are to first identify the goals of the project. For this project, we're pretty focused on that economic and demographic chapter that will go into the comp plan document. The next step we took was to start by analyzing secondary data and any local data that's available to understand the demographics, economic forecast, and housing needs within the community. We then worked with the Imagine Girdwood group to ground truth the findings that we saw in that secondary data, and also identify data gaps and tailor the information to better suit the needs specific to your community. We then reached out to key local leaders and stakeholders to conduct interviews and also hear more about housing policy and the development space in the community. The final step we're doing now is sharing out the key findings and also integrating what we're hearing into the updated Girdwood Comp Plan. Some of the key findings from our initial analysis is that we're forecasting demand for at least 170 new housing units for year-round residents in Girdwood. And that would roughly have a demand for 17 to 40 acres of residential land. And that's in addition to a demand for roughly 65 rehab or renovation units of existing units that exist in Girdwood. The breakdown by income, we're seeing that forecasted need will roughly fall 56% into that low income category, 19 in that middle income, and 26 in the high income. We also looked at the influence of short-term rentals on the housing market, and we're seeing that short-term rentals have grown at a rate of roughly 10 to 15 unique listings per year, and account for roughly 16% of the housing stock in Girdwood. For the commercial development, we're seeing forecasted growth in employment for the next 10 years, which could generate demand for 24 acres over that time period. Diving into summary of the specific components that we're looking at, starting with population and housing, we use a methodology or a model that we've developed that's specific for Alaska communities that looks both at the demand for new units as well as the demand for rehab or replacement units in a community. And we think both of those pieces are really important, mainly because maintaining the existing units in a community allows for the new units to really make the impact that they're intended to have. If the existing units are not maintained, they have the chance of falling off the market and then contributing even more to the need for that new unit. So we like to highlight both pieces in our forecasts. The demand for new units is primarily driven by population growth, paired with the need that currently exists in a community. We like to refer that to as a pent-up demand in a community, and is usually indicative of some of the overcrowding metrics that we see. The rehab and replacement is specific to each community that we look at and is a combination of housing characteristics that we look at, including the age of housing, also housing units without complete plumbing and kitchen facilities, and then also mobile home units. And we combine those factors to come up with a replacement rate that is specific to each community. For this forecast, we're forecasting 3 modest population growth scenarios in Girdwood. Over the past decade, Girdwood's population has remained relatively flat. The population forecasts used for this model take into consideration some pent-up demand that has been identified in the community due to lack of housing options. This model also assumes that with more housing options, more people can and will choose to live in Girdwood. The 3 scenarios that we looked at employ kind of 3 different average annual growth rates, which is that AAGR acronym that you're seeing on this slide. The first scenario, which we call the low scenario, is based on the Department of Labor population forecast for the municipality of Anchorage and is roughly a 0.2% average annual growth rate over the next 10 years. That would result in a population growth of an additional 50 people in the community. The second scenario we looked at is what we're calling the medium growth scenario and is based off the Anchorage 2040 land use plan and has an average annual growth rate of 0.8% over the next 10 years, resulting in an estimated growth in population of roughly 200 people. And the final scenario that we looked at is what we're calling that high growth scenario and is based off the Department of Labor forecast for the Mat-Su borough, with an average annual growth rate of 1%. And that might seem odd to look at the Mat-Su borough, but we're really using that as a proxy for a population in Alaska that is not constrained by housing. So it gives us a picture of what could growth look like if housing was not constraining population growth. And under that high scenario, it would result in a population increase of roughly 200 people over the next 10 years. The other piece that we look at is pent-up demand that currently exists in the community, and overcrowding often signals pent-up demand. We look at the data published by the census through the American Community Survey as a proxy for overcrowding, which is showing roughly 70 households would be considered severely overcrowded in Girdwood today. One note about that data, we acknowledge that this has a high margin of error because of the small sample size, and this is not intended to be an exact estimate of the exact number of households, but more of an indication of the scale of the pent-up demand that currently exists within a community. So this is more of an indicator for scale rather than a precise data point that we're using for this model. So putting all those pieces together, we come up with a housing need forecast. This is an example of, like I just talked about, we did 3 growth scenarios. So we ended up coming up with actually 3 different housing need forecasts. Just for brevity and clarity, I'm just going to cover the mid-population growth scenario in this presentation. And under that scenario, we're forecasting demand for roughly 100 new housing units due to population growth. And we're seeing a need for an additional 70 new units due to that pent-up demand in overcrowding, with an additional 65 units needed in that replacement or rehab category. And so that would be 65 existing units being rehabbed or replaced, which gets us to that 235 total estimated unit need over the next 10 years. Just for some context, the population scenarios change that number slightly. So under the low scenario, that number would look more like 165 total units needed. And under the high growth scenario, that would be upwards of 260 total housing units needed over the next 10 years. We then take that housing unit estimate and we translate that into the residential land use forecasts for this study. And that, again, it can be arranged depending on growth and build out scenarios. So we look at the mix of existing building trends in the community, which tends to lean right now heavily towards that single family unit, with 70% or over 70% of the existing units being single family. Under that scenario, under the existing building trends, there's demand for roughly 40 acres of residential land. Under a higher density build out scenario that leans more heavily towards a multifamily build out scenario, that could be lower, closer to that 17-acre estimate that we're showing here. So this is presenting a range based upon different types of build out scenarios. We also look at housing need broken down by income category. This is a graphic that we like to call our housing bridge, and it shows the forecasted need for housing broken out by income level. So you can see that 235 total unit need that we discussed previously for that total need is in the middle there, and then it's broken out by lower income households, which are defined as 80% AMI or area median income. And then that would result in 120 units needed for that lower income range. And then we also break it out by middle income, which is between that 80% and 120% AMI. We're forecasting need for roughly 40 units in that income category. And then the higher income category in that teal is the above 120% AMI. And we're forecasting a need for 75 units in that income category. Another layer to this graphic is in the gray center area, which is showing a breakdown of our estimated need based on tenure. So you'll notice in that lower income category, there's a higher need for rental product with 75, we're forecasting a need for 75% of the lower income units would be needed in that rental product, and only 25% in the ownership type. And that, as the income ranges increase, tends to swap more towards ownership products. So in that middle income, we're seeing a need for 72% ownership and only 28% rental. And then in that high income, we're seeing the vast majority with 93% in the ownership product type and 7% in that rental product type. We also conducted some employer interviews back in March as part of this effort. And this is a slide just summarizing some of the key topic areas and findings that we came away from those interviews with. One of the main findings was that there is a housing shortage and it is impacting big businesses negatively in Girdwood. We also heard that the situation has been getting worse in the last 4 to 8 years. And employers express that they are losing workers and they also are struggling to recruit new workers. And also we heard that employers are starting to put more resources toward housing because it is a bigger issue. There was an estimated need for at least 100 units based on these interviews with employers. There was some preferences for 2 to 3 bedroom units that could be used by families or singles that have roommates. There was a variety of type that was expressed interest in. So townhome style, some small cabins, even some mobile home and manufactured homes. So there's some expressed interest for varying types of housing products in the community. We also discussed housing affordability, and there was a mixed interest in affordability and housing within the community. So some of the people that we spoke with said housing needs to be more affordable, and not just the high-end single-family homes that they're seeing developed. Some of the employers felt that any new housing would benefit the community to some extent, as it gives people an opportunity to move out of maybe the more affordable units as they make more money into the higher income, more expensive units, and kind of free up some of the lower end of the housing stock. And then overall, there was a general need for more workforce housing. Some of the solutions that businesses are currently pursuing include master leases for units in Girdwood. Some employers are providing a commute stipend or taxi vouchers for employees who are commuting. There are some employers that talked about sharing employees with other big employers like the resort in the community. And then generally there is some support and acknowledgement that the resort is working on solutions and bringing economic activity into the community. Some of my creative ideas that they discussed for the future included the use of dark homes to address some of the need in the community, and possibly developing a community-based property management entity. leveraging investments like Holton Hills to generate affordable housing, focusing on procurement. And then there was also a lot of uncertainty around short-term rentals and their impact on the housing market in Girdwood. Which dovetails nicely into another topic area that we explored through this analysis, which was short-term rentals. There is limited data available around short-term rentals still. We did look at 3 different data sources for this effort, including all the rooms, Air DNA, and then also through the Treasury Department through a platform called Host Compliant. So we tried to find the data that was out there, but we acknowledge that it is still limited. Some of the key trends that we identified are that there is growth in the number of unique listings of short-term rentals in Girdwood. And we're seeing on average 10 to 15 new short-term rentals are being added in Girdwood each year. We also looked at short-term rental density, which is measured primarily in 2 different ways. The first being the percent of short-term rentals to total housing units in a community. In Girdwood, roughly 16% of the housing units are being used for short-term rentals in some capacity. That's comparable to Homer, which has roughly 15% of their total housing units are being used for short-term rentals. Compared to some other parts of the state, though, it's pretty high. So the Kenai Peninsula, for example, only 7% of the total units are being used for short-term rentals, and that's even lower in places like Southeast Alaska, like in Juneau, where only just under 3% of the total housing units are being used for short-term rentals. Another way to measure short-term rental density that we looked at is comparing the number of short-term rentals to the population. So this table on the right shows the number of short-term rentals per 1,000 population. And you'll see that Girdwood has a very high density when we're measured this way. So in Girdwood, 105 short-term rentals per 1,000 population, which is significantly higher than Homer at only roughly 60 short-term rentals per 1,000 population. And I thought that was an interesting finding, and compared to the other measure of density where we're looking at total number of housing units, where Homer and Girdwood were very close together, I feel like it highlights how unique the market in Girdwood is and how short-term rentals only are a small piece of the puzzle. It may not include other seasonal or part-time housing uses in the community. Looking forward, so on average, short-term rental listings increased at a rate of roughly 3% since 2020. If that growth rate were to continue, we could see an increase of about 85 short-term rental listings by 2032. And just to note, land demand for short-term rentals is not estimated due to the potential for conversions and or new units. So short-term rentals could be a new unit, or it could be a conversion of a total unit or a partial unit. So it's really challenging to forecast land demand for short-term rentals at this time without any additional data, because we don't know how the future short-term rentals will materialize in terms of new builds versus conversions. The last piece of the puzzle that we looked at was employment trends and commercial land demand forecasts. So employment in Girdwood was hit pretty hard by the pandemic, but by 2020, employment had returned to pre-pandemic levels. Leisure and hospitality account for roughly 70% of the total employment in Girdwood. The next big group would be that trade, transportation, and utilities bucket, which includes both retail and wholesale trade. Growth in education and health was driven mostly by the Girdwood Health Clinic expansion. And I will note this data, this was a direct data request that we got from the Department of Labor, which is based off of the quarterly census of employment and wages, or QCEW data. And that data reports employment by place of work. So this includes commuters who may not live in Girdwood as well. It's just counting the total employment that exists within Girdwood. So just a distinction to be aware of. We then took the employment and forecasted it out for the next 10 years. So based on the Department of Labor sector-based employment forecasts and historical trends in Girdwood, we're forecasting a net change of roughly 630 additional employees in Girdwood over the next 10 years. Similar to what we did with the residential land demand, we then translate the demand for that employment demand to employment or the demand for commercial land within the community. And you'll notice at the bottom of this chart that we were forecasting a total of 630 employees, but this is only showing space for 540 employees. And I just want to highlight that is because there are employees with no space demands. So either employees that work remotely or employees that work jobs like construction that don't require necessarily a physical space are not included in the land demand calculations that we used. We take the sector-based employment forecasts and we take industry standards based on land use type, broken down by office, industrial flex, retail, accommodation, food service, and industrial. And we do what we call a crosswalk of the space needs by sector to come up with a forecast for the acreage needed to accommodate the employment needs in a community. So based on the employment forecast, we're estimating a total of 24 acres of commercial land will be needed to accommodate the additional 630 employees forecasted for Girdwood. Some of the key takeaways and next steps. The Girdwood Comp Plan should accommodate at least 40 acres of residential and 25 acres of commercial, which would be that 10-year forecast. But we also encourage you to think about maybe a longer term planning horizon in that 20 or 30-year land demand. And having more land available than what is immediately demanded allows you to be more flexible and responsive to market opportunities as they arrive. We also suggest considering other areas of policy that may be worth addressing or collecting more complete information around data gaps that currently exist in the community.
We'll start you right here, Bree.
Sure. Yeah. I think so. I'm going to be presenting the two land use plan maps, and these are drafts. They're intended for the community to give us feedback on. And before I get into both of the maps, I just want to go back over some of the stuff leading to this. So all of that information that Michelle presented, all of the vision and goal work that Holly's been very involved with, working with Imagine Girdwood. And then in addition to that, we did do environmental land use or environmental land suitability map. And that was looking at different environmental factors that affect the potential for land to be developed. Yeah, this is a great slide to go to. So we looked at several different things such as slopes, avalanche hazards, flooding hazards. Within all of those different environmental factors, categorized elements that were suitable to build, marginally suitable, and unsuitable, layered those all together to develop this land suitability analysis. So that really tells us where can development happen, or where is it hindered due to some environmental factor. And that's an important step in developing the land use maps, in addition to all the other work. So I just wanted to go over that. I know we've had meetings in the past where we've gone over that, but that is also an important foundation to the maps. And so in addition to that, looking at the 1995 land use plan, looking at the more area specific ones like Holly talked about at the beginning, we're taking a look at the comprehensive plan and the area specific ones. Do we make maps that are consistent with these, or do they differ? And that's all part of the process. So based on all this, we came up with two draft land use plans. So for each of them, I'm going to go over kind of the overarching concept of the plan. I'm going to go over the land use categories within each of the maps because most of the categories are the same, but there are some slight differences. And then we'll look at the map and I'll talk through it generally. So starting with what we're calling scenario A, expanded Alpine Town Center. The kind of overarching vision and goals was to create opportunities for more mixed use commercial and residential development within the core portion of the town. And this is really stemming from us reading your vision and goals. Creating more opportunities for mixed residential development. If you look back at the 1995 plan, there's a lot of the yellow color, which in that plan is identified as single family homes. So these other plans are trying to implement your goal of more housing opportunities by identifying more opportunities for what's called mixed residential, so more than essentially one unit. On this one, we also included an active transportation network that was iterated in your vision and goals several times. The goal of being able to get around Girdwood on trails. And when we say active transportation network, what the vision is for that is something like a multi-use trail, like the green belt system you see in Anchorage. So that's what we mean by that term. And then this one, the intent is also to potentially create more design standards around Main Street style development. And that would happen through zoning design standards, but in your land use plan, you can identify kind of broader visions like Daniel talked about. So that is scenario A. So yeah, jumping into the land use categories, I'm going to read through all of these in the table for the scenario A, and then in scenario B, I will just highlight the differences. So for scenario A, we have two categories for residential. One is what we're calling lower density with cottage craft, and the other one is higher density residential with in-home business. And one of the goals that we thought was important to carry forward in the land use plan map was opportunities for intermixing residential and commercial. So that's why both of those have some level of commercial opportunity. It might be very small, but both do. And something to note, the lower density one would still allow for, or our vision would be for it to allow for duplexes, condos, and townhomes, since one of the goals was to allow for duplexes across all residential uses. The higher density, though, could accommodate whatever level of residential development you would like, whether that would be up to like a larger apartment building or garden style apartment unit, something like that. Next is mixed use. So that's commercial uses with a small to medium footprint with residential permitted as well. And then we do have a commercial, just a commercial use identified. So those would be areas where residential was not included. There's a commercial / industrial use. And then we have two kind of mountain specific land uses that the older 1995 plan did have uses centered around the mountain. So we thought that was important to carry forward. One is mountain mixed use. And really the difference between that and the mixed use category is that the commercial opportunities would be more focused on mountain recreation, since these zones end up at the base of the mountain and other recreation areas. And then mountain open space would be limited infrastructure. It would really be intended for outdoor recreation, but unlike open space or parks, maybe the potential for built infrastructure, maybe around a public nature center or cabins or something like that. Next is open space. So these could be natural areas. They could also be dedicated parkland if they are currently. And then parks are specific dedicated parkland. And then the last category is public lands and institutions. So that's like schools, libraries, civic centers, and other government buildings. On this scenario A, we also have a black dashed line for what we're calling Alpine Community Core, and that's this concept of an expanded kind of Main Street style area that would potentially go beyond your current kind of town square area. And then we've also highlighted transportation corridors in both maps and active transportation corridors in maps as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk through this scenario A map. Thanks. I think, yeah, zooming in helps. And on both maps, I'm going to start at the town square. So in the blow up on the right, that is the area, the center, kind of center down, yes, with the green park in the middle and the commercial development around it. So in this scenario, we've kept that commercial area, and then the orange is the mixed use category. So that's the one that allows for commercial and residential. And that really centers in this black dashed line core. So the idea is that opportunities for this Main Street style development could expand north, and then it could expand east towards the mountain. In there as well are some pockets of blue. That's the public land. So that's like where the school is currently, where the library and the fire station are currently. And then even beyond the black line, we still identify some potential for mixed use. And really, the idea here is to concentrate the density for commercial and the density for residential around this core area and around existing infrastructure. And then beyond that, we start to get into kind of this lower, what would feel like a lower density use, but be residential. So the brown we identified as has the opportunity to have higher residential, not that it automatically would become that, but those areas have the opportunity to allow for more unit type development. And then the yellow was the lower density housing, but still allowing for the condos and townhomes. And then the other thing we want to point out, and this will be the same on both maps, is kind of what's happening at the base of the mountain. We have the darker purple being the mountain mixed use. So that's still opportunities for commercial and residential, but the commercial would be more focused on recreation uses related to the mountain. And then beyond that is the mountain open space. The area along the highway is identified as commercial industrial. So it allows for a mix of both. Before there was some specific industrial land and specific commercial land, and those categories have been combined in that area. And a lot of, for both of the maps, a lot of the shapes that you're seeing are very similar to the 1995 plan, because the 1995 plan was also based on the environmental constraints. So the shapes they came up with were factored in by slopes and floodways and all of that. And so we brought those forward here. I think one difference is the area south of the library. The 1995 plan does have land use going further down than where we show it. We just show it in the orange there. And we decided to show that the area south of that is open space because it is part of the floodplain. So there's less potential development there just because of the environmental factor. Okay, so yeah, we can jump to scenario B. So in this one, we were calling it trail-oriented development. And I think the biggest distinction is that in terms of residential land use, we weren't trying to divide up what's higher density, what's lower density. Instead, we just have one category for residential. As Daniel said, as things go into zoning, different parts, different parcels start to get identified for different residential zones. But at this level, at this high level, you're not distinguishing between higher density and lower density. that opportunity is spread out throughout Girdwood, which could allow for potentially kind of meeting your goals of providing more housing generally. And it also, the reason why we call it trail oriented is that housing density could be linked to the active transportation network, not necessarily just concentrated at the core of the town. So we still have this active transportation loop and residential, without limiting residential density, you could develop residences around higher density around that trail network. The other thing we wanted to point out about this concept is that there are potentially design standards that would allow you to achieve some kind of more aesthetic goals, whether that's maintaining native vegetation. And that's what's shown in this graphic, the idea that all these different housing units are different. There's some larger units with fourplexes, some smaller single family homes, and they're spread out, but you could create codes where you're maintaining tree cover, hopefully preventing any kind of clear cutting, that sort of thing. This plan also has more open space than the other plan, just in some key areas. So we can go ahead and jump to, and here's the categories. And like I said, this one, we just didn't distinguish between different concentrations of densities there. And we also didn't highlight that main street style development like we did in the other one. So you can go ahead and jump. So again, I'll start at Town Square in the blow up there on the right. And so similar to the other map, we do have mixed use surrounding that area, but instead of that opportunity going to the north, we have it going back along the highway and then also at the base of the mountain. So the idea was to concentrate that into areas that currently have infrastructure where there's access to larger road systems and the base of the mountain. And then similar on this one are the two blue categories, north and south of Town Square. And then the difference in this one is that we extended the blue further south as PLI land, public lands, and institutions, whereas on the other one, it was mixed use, I believe. This one, we have yellow. So on this one, yellow is the residential category. So again, allowing for diverse densities throughout the valley. And so that's why there's a lot more yellow on this map, but again, it would still allow for the higher density residential. And then again, we have the two mountain categories at the base of the mountain. We have the mountain mixed use and the mountain open space. And similar to the other map, we still do have this commercial / industrial use along the highway area to the south. Yes. And this one also shows the blue dots or that active transportation network. So something like a green belt kind of looping through the valley. In the other map, it looped along the red line, which represents the potential for another access road. And that comes from the official streets and highways map. And in this map, that active transportation loop goes down the center of the valley. And I mentioned in the general description that there are some key spots where we show as open space. One of those is where Holly has her cursor right now, just west of there. Yeah, that was shown as residential in the other map. This is shown as open space on this map. And then the other part is just north of the airport. We show that area as open space, and that's based on the trails plan. There were several trails located in that area. And so this one shows it as open space. The other one shows it as mixed use. So I guess I just want to end with saying we wanted to provide two maps that we thought brought forward a lot of the vision and goals as we read them and interpreted them. we're not expecting people to pick one or the other. We're anticipating that people will have specific comments about specific areas. And our goal is to take all those comments and kind of pick pieces from maybe both maps or incorporate things that are missing, things that we maybe didn't think of into a final map. So I just wanted to say that so that people don't feel like it's one or the other and I don't like either or something like that. Our goal is to come up with something that we feel like represents your comments and still meets your goals and visions.